So we've had PlayStation 5 Pro for about 3 weeks now, and I've been playing a lot of games, testing out various different performance settings between 120 modes, Pro patch titles, Pro fidelity modes, all the unpatched games with Game Boost kicking in, of course PS4 games with the Image Enhancer turned on, and PS VR2 titles with a Pro patch as well. There's not much to look at there, but there is still something tangible, and now we're to a point where I feel comfortable giving a semi-final assessment, which I can't imagine this opinion will change too much going into, a month or 2 months down the road, but it is still in this position of very clearly the console is better on paper, but the question still does become how much value would you place on the experience when it's better, sure, but how much better? How do we benchmark that to, say, PS4 Pro, which, in terms of price, there's a stark difference there, and that is the sort of sticker shock with the Pro. There's so many aspects where we can acknowledge yes, the price to performance in the PC space is still very favorable to consoles, and that would include PlayStation 5 Pro. You are getting very good performance even at this, what appears to be unusually high price tag, and it is, in that it's the most expensive console we've ever had. Even when we adjust for inflation looking 10, 20 years back, there's simply no getting around the fact that $699 US, or in some places a lot higher, it's a lot of money, even for an enthusiast buyer, which this console is for. So even somebody that says, yes, I want the Pro, even that price tag did appear to be a lot of money. More so if you are somebody that is the enthusiast that likes to use discs. Now you're in for another $80 to buy that disc drive. God forbid you want to orientate it vertically and you want the nice stand, that's another $30. We all know it is a lot of money. But having said that, if we do look past that for a second and just talk about the performance of the console, what's interesting to me, and I didn't really think this would be the case, although now we can easily see why, looking back to PS4 Pro as an example, the immediate difference was maybe more tangible there in that it was with the adoption of 4K televisions. A lot of people, myself included, that might have been your time where you decided, you know what, now I'll go out and get that 4K television. And some of those early PS4 Pro patch titles, the difference was so tangible right then and there, where you saw checkerboard rendering coming in, giving you a near 4K image quality. A lot of those games also were patched with HDR as well, so there was just something much more immediately noticeable as you fired up some of those early PS4 Pro patched games. PS4 Pro also had Game Boost as well for the back catalog of PS4 titles, but this is where it comes down to how games are made nowadays versus then. Right, PS4 Pro, I mean, a lot of PS4 games, just your standard 900p to 1080p PS4 games, they were all one mode, 30 FPS, sometimes 60, and those games might have been a little unstable, and a PS4 Pro could at times make those titles hit their frame rate cap. But PS5 in a much different scenario, given that the difference maybe doesn't appear to be as big of a jump, but excuse me, if you value high frame rate, this console with unpatched games is in a much better position. So let's talk about Game Boost. The big difference here is that there is just so many more games that were made on this console in a manner to where it's very conducive to playing them on a future console without the need for a patch because of how they were made. If they offer a high frame rate mode or a fidelity mode that lets you unlock the frame rate, then you are going to see a boost on the Pro with the extra GPU compute. It does highly depend on how that studio has made the game and if they offer those settings at all, but we can get a very easy bird's eye view of this with the resources that are out there. I'll leave them linked down below, but we can see just how many games there are with these available settings open to you. And so you can play all these games unpatched, or rather you're going to patch them up to whatever sort of recent patch they're on, but they don't need proper Pro support for you to see frame rate boosts on those games, or if they have dynamic res, it probably will hold the top end of that dynamic res. The weird thing there is that a lot of games, based on internally how they favor their resolution and balance that with increasing frame rate, you can get some really screwy results. Final Fantasy 16, it seems like it favors resolution a lot more with its performance mode, which is dynamic resolution as well. So performance was better, there's no doubt about that, but it was not a lock 60. So the game gets in that VRR window a lot of the time, but not always. Oddly enough, combat, it can stay in the 50s, the higher end of 50s, but just walking around or even standing in sections where, let's say you're in an ether flood, there's just certain visual effects in the scenery that can cause some frame drops. So arguably a title that you would think should be a locked 60 on the Pro. It's simply not happening. But there are still other titles you can check out too, maybe some earlier PS5 games like Deathloop, which has a 1080p high frame rate mode. That's usually in the 100s. If you get into a firefight out in the open, it's going to drop down to like the 60s. But that's a game that still, at the bare minimum, is always going to be 60 now, and you can get it up to possibly 120. Dirt 5, a PlayStation 5 launch title, has a locked 120 nearly the entire time. You can check out something like Uncharted: The Legacy of Thieves Collection, which that game was always like around, 70, 80, 90 frames per second. Those games can now play at a near, locked 120 almost the entire time, which is super cool to see for Uncharted: Legacy of Thieves. One big example here is Elden Ring, which even in the opening area, frame drops are happening almost immediately, even outside of that VRR window. So even the Pro is not able to completely fix or band-aid this game in particular, but it's still able to get into the mid-50s often enough to where a lot of the time the game is now going to start hitting 60 or have the appearance of being 60, but combat areas, it's going to start dropping again. So it's really more a matter of maybe that game not just being that optimized on PlayStation 5, but at the very minimum, it's going to be improved and cleaned up a little bit more on the Pro. So, ironically, the Pro is not like a complete band-aid fix for the entire PS5 library. But if we're going to make the argument of what it's doing for unpatched games, there's a lot more upside on PS5 versus what we saw with PS4 Pro at launch. Now let's talk about Pro patch titles so far, which is also kind of in favor of PS5 Pro, just in that developer support has so far been pretty strong, and we know there's a lot more on the way. So again, comparing it to, say, PS4 Pro, it just seems like there's already a fair amount available to you. But as far as the kind of support you're seeing, that's where it's going to be wildly different, because some studios are offering one new Pro mode or Pro Fidelity, Pro Performance, or in some cases you can access those modes and the old modes, or you can't access the old modes. Or with Insomniac, they're, I think, the one studio that's offering Pro Performance, Pro Fidelity, and also granular settings for RT reflections and ambient occlusion, which is really cool. I mean, I like that there is more options. I think options, generally speaking, are always going to be better versus not having any options at all. But it does give players a lot of agency and the kind of performance they do want to see out of their games. And usually the case is that you're going to find one that you're going to settle on that's probably going to be the Pro Performance mode, since the internal resolution generally you are seeing is going to be a little bit higher. PSSR is going to come in, get these games buffed up to a near 4K image quality. And what we're seeing so far, a lot of this thanks to Digital Foundry for their more thorough look at this, is that PSSR has been delivering some very good results. There are some cases so far that are delivering worse performance, or rather a lesser image quality, given that there can be some visual artifacts or shimmering. We're seeing Jedi Survivor not looking too great, or Silent Hill 2. I personally have not had the chance to fire up these games and look at them myself firsthand, but it doesn't really surprise me that we are going to see some initial growing pains for what is an AI upscaling solution. I think, part of buying PS5 Pro right now is that you can see some immediate benefits for your patched or unpatched game, sure, but you are still buying into a promise that for the remainder of this console generation, you are hoping to get the very best experience for upcoming games. Now, ideally, that should be what you end up getting, but unfortunately, we do have some games that appear to not be turning out all that good. But for what is an AI upscaler, if we look at NVIDIA DLSS, it did take a few years and a few updates to finally be in a position of it being not just a better experience most of the time, but a much better experience all the time. And so PSSR, in theory, should get there at some point. And that is where it's also a bit of an awkward spot, in that we don't know what game is using what version of PSSR internally. There's already been different variations at a certain point, but we are hoping that year 2, year 3 of PS5 Pro in particular, we can see some of these games see even bigger returns. But having said that, we're in the here and now, so a number of games that I was trying out, God of War Ragnarok, the Pro mode there is a dynamic 2160p starting from 1440p. That's going to let you unlock the frame rate, and that was pretty much always above 60. Even during combat, outside of combat, it can easily go up to 90. That's a very clear example of, if I could have played that game on the Pro from start to finish, I easily would have. Gran Turismo 7, 2160p, dynamic locked 120, incredibly smooth. I only played with the 120 hertz toggle turned on and ray tracing off, but it seems like with ray tracing on, you can see a pretty dramatic improvement in just visual difference with how that game looks, and it is quite a looker on PlayStation 5 base consoles. Stellar Blade, easily one of the coolest experiences so far. It's got a Pro Max mode for native 2160p, I believe, and unlocking the frame rate lets the game go above 30 FPS because it will be capped otherwise. So you do have the option to turn the frame rate cap on or off, and you can get around 50 on average. Going to want a VRR display to clean that game up. If you are playing on a VRR display, then the regular Pro mode was a far better experience, opting for 1800p internally, but still dynamic to 4K, and unlocking frame rate will get you around 70 to 80 frames per second. That game looked just gorgeous on the Pro, and that is no doubt how I'm going to see through the rest of my playthrough. The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, the Pro mode, 1440p output to 4K with PSSR, 60 FPS. Kind of an open and shut case. If you're ever going to play The Last of Us Part 2, that is the way to do it. Alan Wake 2 is one that is a bit problematic still with that visual quality. I played on Pro Mode's high frame rate option. Even with occasional drops, it was still how I would probably want to play that game for the rest of it, because it finally did look very nice. The game initially came out with only a 30 FPS mode. It took a little bit to see that 60 FPS option come in. Demon's Souls was an interesting one with its PSSR inclusion. That, made a meaningful difference to me just at the naked eye. The thing we should note immediately is that as far as footage goes, YouTube compression, this stuff might not be nearly as obvious, but sitting right in front of me, I was hearing that Demon's Souls wasn't going to be that big of a difference, but it is resolving the near 4K image quality that was already getting scaled up from a higher internal resolution target versus the standard console's performance mode. So right in front of me, it looked a lot cleaner at 60 FPS, and that was a game that I was just in no way, shape, or form ever going to humor the idea of playing at 30. So looked fantastic. Another one, Horizon Forbidden West. You're going to want to go performance. It's not using PSSR, but the image quality is outstanding. 60 FPS is without a doubt the way to play that game, and it's one where it's one of the best looking console games ever, and it just looks it's just a notch above what it was already doing. And then there's Ratchet and Spider-Man 2. Again, you have those more granular settings for RT reflections and ambient occlusion. There's just a lot to digest. I mean, the console is giving a better experience pound for pound in a lot of these games that I've spent time with so far, and it's something where undeniably you can say, I want to play on the Pro now. All right, let's move on to PlayStation VR 2 support. There's really not much here to look at because there's only 3-4 games that actually have a Pro patch right now, that being games like No Man's Sky, Gran Turismo 7, Kayak VR Mirage. Those two games in particular I did look at. Kayak VR Mirage is a gorgeous looking VR game on the base console, and it still looks fantastic here. The studio is saying the game now has 8K textures, and they've bumped up post-processing effects, detail quality, LOD distance, anti-aliasing, so it all should look better on the Pro. The hard thing about this is that the game always looked good on the base console. It does look amazing on the Pro, but it's really hard to quantify that in the sort of moment-to-moment experience, especially when, if I try to do direct comparisons, you basically need 2 VR headsets, 2 consoles running back-to-back, and take on off the headsets back and forth, and it's not nearly as easy to discern any sort of improvements there. So it looked amazing. How much better? I can only say for how fast I can then switch it over to another console, which in my case I only have one headset, so it's even more pain in the ass to try and figure out some comparisons. One that did seem a lot more tangible, however, is Gran Turismo 7, because the Pro patch recently came out. It does offer an option to turn off reprojection, and it looked good. The ghosting is gone too, which was a problem for some, if you can easily notice the ghosting effect on PSVR 2 for that game in particular. A number of games that use reprojection, that's the problem. And so we can see with the patch coming in, it can greatly improve the experience, but it seems like you will need that patch. So far with unpatched games, it's going to really be a mixed bag. Now, I was not able to test this too thoroughly, so I'm going to default to without parole Brian's coverage on this, because the results he was seeing there is that some games, yes, can see a frame rate fix, whether they're reprojection games or not. I guess that's sort of the experience he was seeing, is that some games can be cleaned up. Others, it's like exactly the same on PS5 Pro. So it's not really going to be an immediate difference in the VR landscape. Now, hopefully in the next 1-2 years, we'll see a lot more VR titles either get a patch or ship with PS5 Pro enhancements right away, because as far as, you know, having to lean on, say, reprojection or getting higher frame rate in the VR experience, which is very important, we could see some big differences. But right now, there's very few to go around. Now, one feature that we can't really undermine here is the PS4 Image Enhancer in settings, which you can turn on. It's a blanket on-off toggle, and it will apply to most PS4 games that you're playing. If they are falling into a certain category here, it is a little bit narrow in that if you're playing a pro title that has a resolution mode above 1080p, this enhancer is going to be turned off. It's a basic post-processing, possibly AI upscaler. It's not going to work, and it doesn't really need to be on for a pro patched game, obviously, if it does have a higher resolution mode, but it's not on for those titles. It's not on for classics. You can't turn it on for PSVR 1, but it can still be on for a number of very basic non-PS4 Pro 1080p or under games. And the results are going to be wildly different. It really depends on how the game looks, how it was made, which is kind of a running theme with this entire discussion surrounding PlayStation 5 Pro. But, you know, some titles, it is a meaningful difference if it is a game with a lot of high contrast areas, very colorful, just based on art direction. You can see some pretty big differences. I really don't want to undermine games like Octodad or Gravity Rush Remastered, Little Big Planet 3, Katamari. Like, it was a tangible difference where you don't have to zoom in or anything. I mean, whether it's on video, on YouTube with compression kicking in, or if it's right in front of you, it does look meaningfully different. And that's a very old PS4 game that is now seeing enhancements on PlayStation 5 Pro. And I think that's really, really interesting and a good value add to this console. Having said that, those titles are few and far between. There are still a number of games that might fall in that category of 900p, 1080p games, and if they do have a film grain effect, maybe a lot of chromatic aberration, the filter is on, but it's not really doing anything visually to where you're going to notice that in the moment-to-moment gameplay, which is disappointing, but it really depends on how that game looks. Generally, what you will see, no matter what, is on-screen elements, UI, menus, any sort of text on screen that is going to resolve a cleaner image quality. And so it's certainly a nice thing to have on top of everything PS5 Pro is doing so far. Pound for pound, it does seem like there's a lot going on here for what this console is doing to unpatched games versus PS4 Pro. So with all that in mind, where am I at on PS5 Pro? I think I am enjoying the experience more than I thought I would. It very much is that best of both worlds thing. I mean, so many Pro Patch games that I've played so far, it's a very simple, without having to really dive into the details of what's the internal res, what is PSSR doing, what kind of visual effects are you seeing. You know, at a very surface level, I'm getting a really nice resolution, and now at 60 FPS or higher, just at that sort of cursory glance, it's the best of both worlds, and it's a great way to play games. There's really no arguing that for most titles. Again, we've got some fringe cases so far where there's some growing pains, and hopefully those do get worked out, but it's not like I wouldn't want to start playing my games this way. And I'm somebody that has always liked the very best out of my games and technology. Now, I am primarily a console player. I've always enjoyed that ease of use with the console and TV experience, the plug-and-play nature, the optimized UI. And so, you know, because that's what I'm always into, PlayStation 5 Pro does speak to me on that level. And I think I do like it a lot more than what I did with PS4 Pro back in 2016. But it does still beg the question, is it worth it? And that is such a complicated thing to answer, given there are so many ways to frame it, because you can make the case that price to performance versus the PC landscape consoles are always going to be better there, so it does still work for the Pro in this case. Or you can look at historical data for consoles, adjust for inflation, and you can frame it in a good or bad way, so there's two camps there. I've also personally been of the mind where when it comes to certain product reviews, I would place less importance on price, if only with the core principle of I don't know what your financial situation is, and so it's better to just simply talk about the product. Is it good, bad, neutral? And then it's up to you to determine what you are willing to pay, because you also have agency in how you buy products. You could pay full price MSRP, you could sell things to buy it, maybe you just got a recent bonus and so it feels free to you, maybe you can wait 2-3 years down the road, buy a used PS5 Pro. So that's always how I've approached it. I don't generally like to say, you know, if it's a good value for you, or even for me for that matter, because I don't want to influence it in that way. But here's what I'll answer, because I found this to be a very fascinating question that I have gotten here and there, which is, would you still buy a PS5 Pro if you didn't have this channel? I cover PlayStation for a living, and so naturally people expected that I'm going to cover this console. And most people know Sony does not send out review units, so I did, you know, go out of my way. It's all out of pocket for me and everything that I do cover. And here's what I'll answer, right, is that this console is something I would have wanted. And I cannot say that for every PlayStation product I've picked up and reviewed. You know, I'm not a big headphone user. I probably would have not gone out and gotten the Elite or the Explorer. There's generally no reason for me to buy a PS5 Slim on day one if I already had a base console, but I did it for the teardown and unboxing and all that. So, I mean, there's many products that, yes, I am buying them to cover on the channel, but for PlayStation 5 Pro, I can confidently say that I am the kind of enthusiast buyer that would want it. What's really tough to say is, like, I don't know what my financial position would have been if I was not doing well with the channel, and I'm very grateful for that, obviously, but it really depends on what I'm bringing home, especially for something I do want. I would probably try and figure it out. I mean, that's just like even what a young Ryan did when PS3 was coming out, and that was a boatload of money in 2006, because I was huffing copium thinking the console was going to be amazing on day one. Took a lot longer than that, obviously, even though I still really enjoyed PS3 for what it was at the time. But like, that's how I've always been. Having said that, I do also want to add a little caveat there, in that you should not feel pressured, and I would not want to feel pressured to buy a Pro thinking I have to buy it to get better experiences, when the base console should still be very serviceable for the next 3-4 years. And I still think this thing could have not existed, and we would have safely gone up until 2028 for PlayStation 6, given so many titles do have performance and fidelity modes. You do have the options, and generally a lot of performance modes have been very good and serviceable, and you're still getting nice looking games. There are certainly some bigger differences, like say Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and you would hope that's not going to be the new normal for the next 3-4 years, where if you want to play a high frame rate game and not have it look like Vaseline was smeared over the screen, that you would have to buy a Pro. You don't want that to be the case. Same for, say, Dragon's Dogma 2, where it's got a really unstable frame rate, and you don't want to feel pressured to buy the Pro. So I would hope that the next 3-4 years becomes this place of a lot of standard console games still looking and playing perfectly fine, but if you want just a little bit more, then the Pro is there as a viable, if not pricey, option. And I think that's where the Pro is right now. You can skip it, and I think you will really enjoy the benefits of what, say, PSSR is doing right now, where it's really fleshed out on PlayStation 6. Whether you buy now or in 4 years, I think there's a lot of good experiences to be had. So with that in mind, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video. You take it easy.